good, Yugioh? Back into this video. I have here in my hand an orange deck box, but not any regular deck box. This is my side deck testing deck box that I whip out for every format and test a bunch of cards, which I think are going to be good for the upcoming format. But it turns out these cards are just not as good as I thought they would be, and I'm going to explain to you why. Yeah, I thought these cards were actually extremely good, but it turns out they're just meh in the format. Starting out at the top, DINOWRESTLER PANKRATOPS. Well, it turns out that the format has ramped up and finally revealed its ugly true colors in the form of Appaloosa. Yeah, PANKRATOPS was the type of card that you thought was going to be absolutely amazing going second, and I felt the same. I mean, this card absolutely does so much. It has 2600 attack, you special summon it, you run something over, and then you pop something. But the issue is, Appaloosa exists, and when Fire Kings make the Appaloosa, it's not just the Appaloosa. They have the full board set up as well with stuff like the Garunix in the graveyard, as well as potentially an Ambler Whale, you know, Princess is there as well, chilling. There's no semblance or chance of you getting an attack over the Appaloosa, and the PANKRATOPS just loses value when you try to attribute it. It just gets negated by the Appaloosa, and I realized, wow, they're just better cards at dealing with things than PANKRATOPS right now, right? Especially cards like Cosmic Cyclone that we can kind of, you know, snipe like whatever back row they have, or the Fire King Island. It's a lot better than just PANKRATOPSing and hoping that they don't get to the Appaloosa. And it turns out there are not a lot of Floodgate or Rogue decks in the format that DINOWRESTLER PANKRATOPS can actually benefit from being in our side decks. So I just realized, you know what? This card is actually a lot more mid than I expected it to be. Personally, I thought it was going to be a side deck in everyone's side deck moving forward because this card is just so high impact. But I think we're at the point in the game where the Phantom Nightmare stuff has made it, so this card is just not good because Appaloosa. If Appaloosa was not a thing, then I could definitely see this coming back. But for the current iteration of the game, it just doesn't do enough. So I'm playing better cards that fulfill a similar role without running into Appaloosa personally. Next is Soul Release. This card was very, very hyped, and don't get me wrong, I still think this card is decently good, but it's one of those weird cards where if nobody plays around this card, then it's insane, but the minute people start to respect it, it gets a lot worse. And what I mean by that is there are certain ways to play around this card. Obviously, you can preemptively side deck defensive options against Soul Release, like people are siding Bell, which already hits a lot of cards in the Fire King matchup as well, like Huron in the graveyard, you know, there's Flamberg trying to resurrect things as well, and of course Garunix from the graveyard, and then there's some players that are even siding Lancia because it deals with this, it also deals with Cosmic Cyclone, and it deals with Evenly Matched. So being able to stop the Soul Release and then preventing anything else from being banished, as well as shutting down the SP Little Knight for the rest of the turn, is quite pretty high impact if you ask me. And it just makes it so Soul Release is bad in that aspect. But the most important part is people can actually play around it in Engine as well. So some players are actually being very sneaky clever and using Salamangreat Sunlight Wolf to add back a copy of the engraved Garunix. And when that's in hand, it can trigger during our opponent's turn too, right? So it doesn't mean it's stuck in the graveyard where it's at the threat of being banished by Soul Release. And that just means that all you have is really like the Princess and the Ambler Whale target in the graveyard, which we don't really care about. As long as Garunix is resolving to some capacity, that's really all that matters, right? As long as we have a Fire King to special summon from our hand to use with Kieran, then it's enough. So that's why I think it's gotten a lot worse. This card is also suffers from the assumption that your opponent will be comboing off and setting up a full graveyard. But actually, after playtesting a bunch of mirror matches and different format decks against Fire Kings, I realized that a lot of hand traps are just flying around. And when multiple hand traps hit a Fire King player, sometimes they just pass on a mediocre board that's just their board. So example, they might have just like an Ambler Whale or potentially just like the maybe like one interaction like a SP Little Knight or an Appaloosa on the table, and then they don't have anything in the graveyard. So Soul Release is just like chilling in your hand, and you're like, okay, I can't really get any value out of this. Maybe I can banish a Princess, but it's not really doing that much. It only matters when you're able to banish like a bunch of cards from the graveyard, right? And the whittled down game states, you would rather have Soul Release be like either a hand trap that can actually defend you on the following turn, or like a high impact board breaker, something like Triple Tactics Talent that has a multitude of different options that you can take advantage of. So you're not restricted to just interacting with the graveyard, right? So I found like, because it's a hand trap format, a lot of times you do reach the mid grind game. It's like a very, very mid-range grind game. So it's very hard to capitalize and get some value out of Soul Release. And Lord knows if you draw multiple copies of this, then you are very much bricking and in trouble. So that's why I think it's kind of one of those meh cards. But I can still see this ebb in and out of the format as people adapt to the format. You know, people start respecting more hand traps and like talents and other things, and they forget about slow release. Then this card becomes insanely good. But right now, because there's so many hand traps as well, I just don't think that the grind game really calls for a need for this. And I think the OCG players also realize this in tandem with like Max C in the format, I guess. They just stopped playing it altogether. Next is Anti-Spell Fragrance. This card is obviously still ban-worthy, don't get me wrong. But again, we just talked about slow release being quite bad in the mid-range grind games, and Anti-Spell Fragrance is one of those cards that's only good if you have a board. If you don't have a board with Anti-Spell Fragrance, then you're not doing anything. You're locking yourself out of spells as well. If your opponent hand traps you or double hand traps you, and you're ending on something like in Snake Eyes Ash Pass with a set anti-spell, and you go, okay, activate Anti-Spell Fragrance, all your opponent really needs is like any extender plus a starter to push back maybe the one hand trap that's in your hand, right? And then from there, you're just really struggling. You might have like an Ash Blossom with like an Anti-Spell Fragrance, but they're still going to be able to make a board. They're going to be able to push past your board. And if they're good, they're just going to leave the Anti-Spell chilling on your board, and you draw for your turn, and you're like, oh crap, I can't play anymore because Anti-Spell Fragrance forces me to set cards as well, right? So Anti-Spell has become one of those cards that's only really good when you have a board, and I realize that you don't actually end off with a board every time because everyone's playing hand traps, so it makes this card marginally worse. In fact, I think certain cards that actually get the 1-for-1 value are a lot better, like Solemn Strike. A lot of OCG players have gravitated towards Strike because this is a 1-for-1 trade with something like Snake Eyes Ash. You negate the effect, but you also get rid of the body, so they're not able to send it off to use the effect to summon Flamberg, or use the body as a link climb material, right? Same thing with like Solemn Judgment. This is also very high impact against the board breakers that we talked about, like Trip Attack as Talent, or even Soul Release itself. And this again trades 1-for-1 with the card, so you're not kind of like stuck without a board. Like if I summon an Ash and I pass on an Ash and I have Solemn Judgment or Solemn Strike, I probably feel a lot better than if it was an anti-spell, right? Especially Strike, because I don't have to pay that many life points. Whereas anti-spell, you really just potentially lock out yourself. So that's my thoughts on anti-spell. Although I'm curious to hear your guys' thoughts. I still think this should be banned though. It's way too broken with the board. Next is Super Polymerization. This card I don't think is that great because a lot of players are now playing around it and ending on boards that are not super polyable. If they're somewhat confident, they're going to end off with like an Appaloosa and maybe like an Ambler Whale as a full combo, and then have a bunch of cards in the graveyard in their hand diversified. So your Super Poly is not going to be the first action that you're activating. In fact, it's only going to get value if you use one of your own monsters in conjunction with theirs, or if you wait until like you play into their board and then a bunch of fire monsters hit the table, but by then it's often too late. And Super Poly is just like Kurikara, where you kind of have that weakness that you can't use this right away, right? This is the type of card that you want to use right away. And I know that Mud Dragon is really, really powerful, but it doesn't matter if you're already playing into the board and you're losing resources. And the only time this is really, really good is when they have two fire monsters, which is really hard for a good player to commit to because they know Super Poly exists. Now, if you do get rid of the Ambler Whale with one of your own monsters, then you run into the part where Kieran is still in their hand, right? Because they added off with Salamangreat Sullen Wolf in the full combo, which means they can still trigger and pop the fire monster from their hand, trigger the Garunix from their graveyard, and then their princess is live again. So that's why I just don't think Super Poly is that great. I think it's an okay card because Mud Dragon is just insane. It prevents targeting. You can call fire and then no effect failure, no imperm, no princess for the rest of the turn. But from my testing experience, I felt like this card is very meh. It's very like high variance. It's very volatile. It's a lot like cards like Drone Lockbird sometimes, where it's either like a huge blowout or it's just like very dead in your hand, depending on how your opponent plays and depending on how you play into the board, right? So those are my thoughts there. And then last but not least, Fantasme. Yeah, you guys are going to crucify me for saying this card is bad. I thought this card was the most broken card because you get to draw two cards at least. Put back one. You're fixing your hand and you're putting a body on the field. But then I realized, you know what? They're going to use Kieran at some point in the combo. So if you're dropping Fantasme on the Linkuriboh, inevitably the Kieran is going to be dumped off of the Garunix, and then that's going to resurrect Fire King monster and pop your Fantasme for free. I know you don't go minus because you still have 5 cards in hand, but is it really worth it? Because Fantasme at that point is just dead, and then you run into the issue where you brick with Fantasme if you draw it as like your 6th card or later on in the duel. I mean, it's kind of nice sometimes when you do draw it as your 6th card because you can actually use it during your turn if you can bait out the princess, but then again, it's just a dead card until you play into your opponent's board, which is never the type of card that we want to have. Like, the type of card quality we want to have in today's power level is cards that we can activate at any time in the duel, ideally, right? So you run into that. And then the other thing I realized is you run into the Ash Blossom part. So Phantasmay is all one effect. It can be ashed. If my opponent ashes on their turn, all they have to do is do their full combo, link off into Salamangreat Sun Wolf, and then add the ash back. And then it's like, ah, crap, this Phantasmay is just a brick in my hand. And I know they might not be able to add back the Kieran in that case because they're adding the ash instead, but it still gives them the option to do that. And anytime you get the Phantasmay ashed, it's just a brick in your hand. And then the other part is the fact that you can obviously wait to do it after the Linkuriboh is summoned and after Kieran is resolved, right? So that means that they're not going to be able to pop it. Well, that's wrong because there's actually another card in the extra deck that can pop it, and that is the Zealantis. So how does this work? Well, they can just link off into the Amber Wheel, go into Zealantis, effect, resurrect everything back on the table. Because they special summon the Phantasmay back to your table, the in effect, the graveyard in engine effect of the Princess will trigger to pop and then special summon. So pops your Phantasmay. Yes, you can discard a card to potentially negate it, but then you're still discarding a card, and they're not losing anything because that graveyard Princess is still there, right? It's still there to be activated next turn. That was a free activation. All they really did was link off the Amber Wheel into the Zealantis. That's all Phantasmay made them do. And then you lose a card because you're discarding to keep the body on the board. I just don't think it's very, very good. And I think you run into a lot of issues between the ways that they can get rid of it and the ways that Ash exists that we just kind of talked about. So in my opinion, I would rather play some more high impact cards, whether that be hand traps or like board breakers, in order to guarantee that there's less variance and to guarantee that those cards are just always good and always live, right? So those are the thoughts that I had after testing these very, very popular side deck cards that we all thought were going to be busted going into the format, but it turns out they all have some inherent flaws and weaknesses. So guys, what do you think about these cards? Do you think I'm wrong on any of the cards? Let me know in the comments below if I missed any points. And also if there are any other cards that you think are really good or really, really bad in the format for side deck wise. So let us know in the comments below. Thanks a lot for tuning in. We'll see you guys in the next video.